So if you have your Bibles open to the book of Jonah, one of the first memories I have when I lived on a street named Charles Avenue when I was a kid. I moved out of there when I was like 5, but I have very few memories of living there. One of them was we had a babysitter that lived about a street behind us. And I don't remember her name, but I remember one thing, that she had goldfish. And the reason why I remember that is the only thing we were allowed to do, that I remember, was to sit on her couch and watch the goldfish. And we weren't allowed to do anything else. And I'm looking back, I'm sure I probably was allowed to do other, but to a kid, that's all I had from my point of view at the time. And my brother, Ryan, he's about a year and a half older than me. And one day we decided we did not want to go to her house. It didn't take us long to decide that. We kept on trying to connive plans on how we can have a little bit of fun, not get into trouble. But one day we decided that we've watched the goldfish enough that we were gonna run away. As a kid, have you ever thought about running away? Maybe as an adult, we still have those thoughts, but they kind of change. Have you ever had somebody in your workplace that when you see, you just run away from them? Maybe you have somebody in your family. If you can't think of that person, maybe you are that person to somebody. Run away. Have you ever run away from God? The book of Jonah starts in an interesting way. Look at verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Now, I know what some of you here are already thinking. We're looking at Jonah. Isn't that what they're teaching in the children this morning? Don't we need to be in one of Paul's letters or, in the New Testament Gospels? I've taught the book of Jonah to kids before. I've taught it many. I know the story about Jonah and the whale, and I'm afraid the book of Jonah has fallen guilty to the old thing of kind of like the game of telephone. When I was in elementary school, the teacher would line us up in the hall if the class wasn't dismissed yet, and we would play everyone's favorite game, the game of telephone. As an adult, I look back, they were just trying to keep us quiet in the hallways. But as a kid, we loved the game of telephone. The teacher would start by whispering a thing, and then that same sentence was told over and over and over until it got to the end, and it had evolved so many times it was nowhere near what it really began as. I've never seen the game of telephone conquered. Ever. Never seen a class conquer the game of telephone. It always gets distorted. And I'm afraid what can happen with these Bible stories is we can tell them over and over and over and reduce them to a kid's level so much where we almost get confused at what it's really about. Can be fallen guilty to that. We think of the book of Jonah, we normally think of, Jonah and the whale. But I submit to you that neither Jonah nor the great fish, because you've been in church a while, it doesn't have to be a whale. It actually says great fish. We assume it's a whale. But you probably think Jonah is the main topic, or the whale, or that whole thing, when I would submit to you that Jonah and the whale, or fish, or whatever you want to call it, we'll get to that next week, is actually the direct object of the story, if you know grammar. The subject of the story is the Lord, specifically the Lord's command. Look which one is mentioned first in Jonah. The word of the Lord, that's the subject, came to Jonah, the indirect object, or the direct object, you see. In the original language, this is written in as Hebrew. The Lord is actually mentioned before words. It actually is the Lord's word came to Jonah. Consider that order. I think that's the order of priority of the subject of the book of Jonah. The Lord's word came to Jonah. Now that's an interesting opening. Usually when we look at the Bible, Paul, an apostle, the servant of the Lord, he's writing to these people. We don't have no one any of that here. This is the most abrupt opening in any book of the Bible. You look at the rest of the 65 books of the Bible, because there's 66 books altogether, you are not going to find an opening of a book, an Old Testament, New Testament, a narrative, a poetical book, doesn't matter, a apocalyptic book like Revelation or anything like that. You're not going to see one like this. See, when we tell the story to kids, let me tell you this sweet story, and when we read it, it gets serious right away. The Lord's word came to Jonah. There is nothing more authoritative than the Lord's word, the word of the Lord. That's an attention grabber right there. And on top of that, look at verse 2. Now, if you've been here, you should know what an imperative is. That's a command. There's 3 in this one. There's 2 right in a row. The Lord's word came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Verse 2 now. Get up, that's a command. The next word, go, that's a command. In other words, God is not messing around here. He's not saying, Jonah, put this on your to-do list. Jonah, schedule this in your calendar this week. No. This is a command from God. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, get up and go. Don't wait this second. The authority behind God's command. Get up and go to that great city of Nineveh and preach, there's the other command, against it, because of their evil has come up before me. That's the beginning of the book of Jonah. What an authoritative command from God. It doesn't get more serious than that for anybody, especially a prophet of God. God is simply not, he's not asking Jonah to do his job as a prophet. He's calling him to do it. He's commanding him to do it. Look at verse 3. Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish. Tarshish is the city that's in the opposite direction. It's mentioned 3 times in a row. And he went there to flee from the Lord's presence. He was a runaway. We expect runaways. We think of rebellious kids, rebellious adults. You don't think a prophet of God would become a runaway from God. It's amazing. It's amazing. Everything about Jonah's action was opposite of God's command. God said, get up. He goes down to Tarshish. He says, go to Nineveh, which is around 500 miles east. He goes to this place called Tarshish, and historians have debated where it is, but we do know it was west. It was in the exact opposite direction. Some think it was on the island of Sicily, some think it was in the lower part of Spain, and some think it was in between the two, but on the northern part of Africa. Either way, it was west when the city he called him to, Nineveh, was east. Why would a prophet of God become a runaway? Why would a prophet of God refuse to tell people about God? He said, arise, get up, go to Nineveh, the great city, and preach against it. Well, Jonah's done that before. He's a prophet. He wants him to go to Nineveh. Why would a prophet of God refuse to tell people about God? At this time, the whole nation of Israel had become very inward focused. A common word today to describe this is called it's not an inappropriate word, but it's a strong word, okay? So it's not swearing or anything. It's called a bigot. Have you ever heard of bigot before? Probably heard it before. Here's what it means. Someone who's strongly partial to their own group, to their own race, to their own religion. Well, if you're not one of us, you're the enemy. That was the attitude Jonah had toward the Ninevites. The whole nation of Israel at this time had that attitude. Jonah's simply a representative. But Jonah had that attitude. You see, the city of Nineveh was not a city filled with Hebrews like he was. The city of Nineveh was filled with Assyrians, the enemies of Israel. He was filled with his enemy. And in fact, their warfare was the most brutal warfare there is. Going to Nineveh would be like God calling you to go to Baghdad, Iraq, and become an open street preacher today with the gospel of Jesus Christ to ISIS. That's exactly what it was. That's exactly what it was. Their warfare and they would ruin cities, they would ravage houses, and they would rape women. They were the ISIS of the day. They would skin people alive even after they conquered him for the sheer sake of dominance over them. Similar to like the Native Americans. After somebody was defeated, they would often scalp them. Why? They're already defeated. To prove their point that they're utterly dominant and they conquered that person is incapable of even holding on to their head. After they were already defeated. Assyrians would skin people alive. Do you want to go there? They would specifically do that against their enemies, and the Assyrians did not like the Hebrews at all. Nineveh was not a city that feared God. I don't think there was a First Baptist Church of Nineveh in that city. They were the ISIS of the day. And God commanded Jonah to go there and tell them all about two things, about God's judgment, cry against them, expose their sins. And along with that came telling them about God's grace. It's not really a message that is naturally in somebody. In their enemies, sometimes we just want our enemies just to be judged. I mean, they deserve it, right? But Jonah was stingy with God's grace. He was stingy with God's grace. He wanted nothing to do with it. He went the complete opposite way. He found a ship going to, the word found, it means he was looking for him. And he found a ship going to Tarshish the opposite way. It's amazing. Let's look at verse 3 and 4 again. I want to point out a couple things. Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. Why does he think that Tarshish is beyond reach of the Lord? He has in his mind that, hey, if I just make it to this city, Tarshish, God won't find me there. That's what he's saying. To go to Tarshish, to flee from the Lord's presence. He went to the opposite way, and in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 19 actually tells us why. This is the book of Isaiah 66:19. I will establish a sign among them, and I will send survivors from them to the nations, the first one there, to Tarshish. Now look down there. He names a couple of other cities. Look at the other hyphen. Who have not heard about me or seen my glory. Tarshish was a city that there was not one believer in. None. Jonah was a runaway, and he wanted to go to Tarshish because there was not a single other believer there. There's nobody that's heard of Yahweh, the God of the Bible. There's no Jewish person. There's nobody that's ever heard of God, and he never wanted to be reminded of God again. He wanted to go to a place where he had no accountability, where nobody could ever ask him about God, and he was going to keep God to himself and quietly hide out and hunker down for the rest of his life. God, I want to go to a place where nobody knows you because I'm running away from your presence. But Jonah was not getting away that easy. Jonah's true goal was to run away from the Lord's presence. When it said he paid the fare and went down into it, it's amazing the great lengths Jonah went to for this. When in verse 4, or for verse 3, I'm going to nerd out a little bit here, stay with me. He paid the fare and went down into it. When the he paid is masculine in the original language, but when it says he paid the fare, the word fare is feminine. How many of you have a car that you've ever personified and called a girl before? Come on, old girl, hold together. That a girl. We do that, don't we? They do it with ships too. And they did it back then. He found a ship and paid her fare. Do you know what that implies? It implies, maybe you've heard this before, that Jonah bought a ticket on a ship. Oh no, Jonah rented the whole ship. He says, this ship's already going to Tarshish. I'm going to rent the whole ship. I'm going to pay for the captain and all of the crew. This is now my ship. It's my private ship. And he goes in. The prophets of God were very wealthy, very wealthy. That implies that paid her fare, paid its fare, paid the fare. That feminine implies that he very well could have rented out the whole ship just for himself. And you know what that tells us? That tells us what great lengths he was going to. I mean, Jonah's heart was so intent. He was looking, Tarshish, you're going to Tarshish? Okay, good. I'm going to make sure, hey, do you know the Lord? Do you know the Lord? No, none of you know the Lord. Great. No one else is allowed on this ship. I'm renting out the whole ship. He made sure that not only he was going to a place that people didn't know the Lord, he made sure that all of the crew did not know the Lord, and he didn't want anybody else to step foot on that boat. He made sure of it. He made sure of it. But he wasn't getting away that easy. Look at verse 4. But the Lord threw a great wind onto the sea, and such a great storm arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is a sweet book of Jonah and the whale. It's such a cute, pretty book. The 4th verse is already people's lives in danger. This book is amazing. I mean, it got serious real quick. That escalated quickly, didn't it? We're on the 4th verse and everyone's about to die. Experienced sailors, they didn't know how to navigate the storm because the Lord threw a great wind on the sea. He wasn't letting Jonah get away. And such a great storm that arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. Jonah thought he was going to hide out in Tarshish, and he was going to rent a boat and get on that boat to escape. And the fact that God sent the storm, you know what he's telling Jonah? I am inescapable, Jonah. God is inescapable. There's nowhere that you can go to hide from God. There's no place you can be where you are away from God that he does not see. He doesn't need night vision goggles to see you in the dark. He doesn't need a GPS system to know exactly where you are and what you're doing. You cannot hide or run from God. God is inescapable. Jonah forgot about Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10. Lord, where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I live at the eastern horizon or settle on the western limits, he said east, he's going west. Even there, your hand will lead me, and your hand will hold on to me. God is inescapable. So what happens now? This ship's about to break apart. This is a very serious storm. What's the scene now? Verse 5. And the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his God. We know these are not the real God that they're crying to, that they're praying to. And they threw the ship's cargo into the sea to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down to the lowest part of the vessel and stretched out and had fallen into a deep sleep. It's amazing. Sometimes as believers, we think if I just disobey God, if I just run from God a little bit, hey, I'm still more spiritual than other people. I mean, I'm certainly more spiritual than unbelievers. I mean, I don't have to obey God in that. Yet when believers disobey God, even unbelievers put them to shame in religion. Did you know that? You have the prophet of God sleeping and the unbelievers are praying. It's a complete role reversal. Complete role reversal. They are putting Jonah to shame right now. And it gets even worse. They're going to lecture Jonah on morals here in a bit. The prophet of God. These people that don't know God. The pagans are praying and the prophet is sleeping. Pagans are trying to get close to their God. My false God, come close. Jonah's running from his. Wants him distant. A runaway believer makes even the pagans look good. And when you run from God, you are both the problem and you're the solution when you run from God. Let's continue reading. The lost people were praying to their gods. Jonah was asleep. Verse 6. The captain approached Jonah and said, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call to your God." That's kind of a rude awakening, isn't it? It's not really polite. He wasn't saying, "Jonah, some fish flew aboard in the storm and we made you some dinner." No. The captain comes down to him, "What are you doing asleep? Get up, call on your God. Maybe this God will consider us that we won't perish." He doesn't know who he is. Come and pray to your God. These were polytheists. That means they believed in many gods. Verse 7. "Come on," the sailors said to each other. "Let's cast lots." It's basically like throwing dice there. They want to figure out what's going on. Whose fault is this? I mean, in other words, think about this. These sailors, it was not their first time sailing. They had that ship. They probably made the trip many times. They know how to read the weather. They knew all about that phrase, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight. How many of you ever heard that before, right? Listen, they knew all the ins and outs. They knew when a storm was a natural storm is coming, and they knew when a storm that was supernatural, that wasn't supposed to happen today. This has to be because of God. They already knew the origin of this storm was sent by a divine origin. That's why they were praying. That's why they realized we're not going to be able to do it. So they decide, whose fault is this? Whose God has done this to us? And they started casting lots in verse 7. So they cast the lots and they singled out Jonah. It fell on Jonah. I mean, can't you just hear, dun, dun, dun? It's amazing. Verse 8, and they said to him, they slaughter him with questions right now. "Tell us who's to blame for this trouble we're in. What's your business? What people are you from? What country and who's your people? Tell us." In other words, they didn't know a thing about him. Jonah didn't get on board saying, "I'm a prophet of the Most High God, and you all need to change your ways and accept that God will send a Messiah. Let me tell you the story of Abraham. Let me tell you." No. Jonah wasn't on that boat as a missionary. He didn't tell anybody that. Only a little bit that we'll get to in a minute. They slaughtered him with questions. "What's your business? Where you come from? Where's your country? What people are you from?" Now, I don't know if you've noticed, Jonah hasn't said a word yet. He hasn't said a word in this book. Until verse 9. He answered him, the first time Jonah speaks, "I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heavens, who made the sea and the dry land." You know, for the first word that Jonah speaks, this may not look like anything in English, but in Hebrew it's significant because the first word in Jonah speaks is the very middle of the first chapter. There's 94 Hebrew words before it. There's 94 Hebrew words after it. The middle is often important. Do you want to know why also that I believe that Jonah is the direct object of this whole book and not the main subject? Jonah is the direct object, and God and his commission is the main subject, because it's also in the middle of the book in Jonah chapter 3, verse 1 that we'll get to. It's the exact same commission that he says in verse 1 of chapter 1. "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it." When you're reading this in the original language, you see that, and that has meaning in that culture. That's the way they wrote. So the fact that Jonah's first words, this whole rebellion, has been silent. He was giving God the silent treatment. Maybe you're here and you're thinking, I've never said no to God. God, when have I ever said no? God's never put something on, I've said, no, I'm not going to do that. Oh, that's not how we say no to God, though. That's not how we say no to God. I'm not asking you if you've ever said no to God with your words in an audible voice. Maybe you're praying and you say, God, no. I would highly doubt if there's anybody here that's done that. But have you ever objected to God not verbally but non-verbally? That's what Jonah's entire protest is non-verbal so far. The first time he speaks is in verse 9. His whole protest was nonverbal. He didn't say anything back to God. In fact, even here, he's not talking to God. He's talking to the sailors. He simply flees his commission without comment, without explanation. Have you ever had someone tell you to do something, and then in your mind you're thinking, well, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, but you don't say it, you just say, and walk away, and you walk away thinking, I'm not doing that. I'm never speaking of that again. You just ignore it. That's what Jonah did. He didn't verbally object to God. It was a nonverbal protest. It was a silent treatment. That's exactly what happened here. Jonah heard the command, and then you know what he had thought of? He heard the command, God, I hear what you say, but then I started thinking afterwards, and then reality set in, and God, I know you want me to do that, but what would that really look like in my life if I did that? That would really, once reality sets in, how many decisions have you talked yourself out of without saying no to God? Verbally, but non-verbally. You have. Jonah would say, well, reality set in. It's awfully dangerous there. That's not going to work for me. But he never said a word. Have you ever had God clearly speak to you and put something on your heart, whether you're reading the Bible, whether you've seen something on in somebody's life, or maybe even during a church service when you're hearing the teaching and preaching of God's word, that you know that God is clearly putting something in your heart. But then you go home and you go back to your life and reality sets in and maybe I shouldn't say something to my spouse about that. That would kind of change our lives. Maybe that's not really that practical. I'm just not going to say anything of what God was putting on my heart. Runaway. That's Jonah. Silent to God's command. Get back home, we get to our regular lives. Reality sets in, and we come to the conclusion, now we don't say this, but we can come to the conclusion that obeying God is impractical. And we can say that with our actions. That's what Jonah did. That thinking that's just not going to work for me. First time he speaks is in verse 9. Not responding to God's prompt is saying no to God. That's what we need to realize this morning. If God is prompting you in your heart, or if he has, if you fail to respond to that prompt, then that is saying no to God. Saying no to God does not have to be a verbal no. You don't have to rent a boat and go the opposite way. Just simply failing to respond to God's prompting in your life is saying no to God. Have you ever been a runaway? He protested in silence, gave God the silent treatment, and boy, was he in trouble for it. Finally, he speaks in the center of chapter 1. I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heavens, who made the sea and the dry land. Look at what they said. The sailors responded, verse 10. Then the men were seized by great fear. In other words, Jonah wasn't scared the whole time, but the unbelievers were scared that he disobeyed God. The role reversal continues. And they told him, they said to him, verse 10, "What is this that you've done?" Even the unbelievers knew that he was wrong. The unbelievers had a higher moral compass than the prophet in this chapter. They start lecturing Jonah on what's right and wrong. "What is this that you've done?" They knew that he was fleeing from the Lord's presence because he told them. He fills that in. Verse 11, "So they said to him, 'What should we do to you so that the sea will calm down for us?'" In other words, they realize, Jonah, you're still going to be in trouble. But man, why'd you bring this on us? Another trick we fall for is when we think running from God only concerns us, that it doesn't drag others into the equation. Oh yes, it does. It hurts others as well. Every prompt you fail to respond to God affects other people. This whole book is what's called a commission narrative. And it's incredibly applicable for the church today. Are we going to obey God's commission? Are we just going to be silent and say no without saying no? Are you going to obey God's commission? If you don't think it's only going to affect you. No. The sailors, what shall we do to you that it's going to calm down for us? They're saying, Jonah, your problem is now our problem too. Our lives are in danger. The sea's getting worse, verse 12. He answered them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, that it will calm down to you, for I know I'm to blame for this great storm that's against you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get the sea on land. They had some stubbornness in them too. They didn't want to do it. They actually had compassion on the man that put their life in danger. The sailors that were unbelievers, that worship pagan gods, had a higher moral compass still than Jonah. Jonah was fine putting their life in danger, but when they first said, "You're going to have to throw me overboard," well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to put you in danger. Let's try again and row hard. Still showing they had a higher moral compass than Jonah. But that did not work. They couldn't because the sea was raging with them more and more. Look at verse 14. This is the turning point in chapter 1, 14. "So they called out to the Lord." That's in all caps. That's Yahweh. These are the unbelievers realized, hey, my God didn't answer. Did yours? No. Captain, did yours? No. First mate, did it? Did your God hear? No. Second mate, it's like, do I have to answer? Look, the storm's going out there. They realized all their gods did not answer. And so, but this man who's Jonah, his God is the reason why we're in the storm. His God's the real God. And finally, what happens here is these pagan sailors were converted. Look at verse 14. They cried out to the Lord. That's the God of heaven, Yahweh. "Please, Lord, let us not perish because of this man's life, and don't charge us with innocent blood. For you, Lord, have done just as you please." That was their prayer. In other words, what they were saying is they knew they needed to throw Jonah overboard, but they knew, like, well, we don't want to get in trouble with God for doing this. So they said, "God, please don't charge us with the blood. We feel like this is what we have to do to right the situation." So they picked him up, verse 15, and Jonah, and threw him into the sea. And immediately the sea stopped its raging. Now, if they weren't converted before, they know who's God now, don't they? Look at how they responded in verse 16. "The men were seized by great fear of the Lord, and they offered sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." Jonah didn't want to tell anybody about the Lord. He ended up having a few converts anyway, didn't he? Jonah was exposed as a hypocrite. You know the number one reason why people don't come to church today? You hear it all the time. Well, church is just full of hypocrites. We've heard that. Hypocrites. Jonah was exposed as a hypocrite. Often we say no to God, we think we're protecting ourselves, but we're not. We're actually headed toward danger. And when you say no to God, you're a hypocrite, and you will be headed towards an exposure of that hypocrisy. And the world knows. They know. Can I tell you a secret? People that don't know Jesus expect Jesus' followers to be like Jesus. They expect them to be like Jesus. What a first chapter. What an amazing. Some of you are thinking, you haven't read verse 17. I really think that goes in the next chapter, so I'll start that there next week. Ends with the sailors there. Ends with the sailors. We have Jonah in the sea, and we have a boat full of converts. People that have just seen the Lord work and just prayed for the first time to the real God. And that whole boat, their captain, first mate, second mate, and everybody there is headed toward Tarshish, who doesn't know God. God worked out Jonah's rebellion for good. Jonah said, I'm going to go to Tarshish. There's nobody there that knows the Lord. Well, you're not going to go there, but I'm going to use you to send a whole missionary team there that knows the Lord. God doesn't just care for Nineveh. God cares for Tarshish also. You see, what this tells us, what does this mean for us today? What does this mean for us? Let's face it, in 2024, correction. In 2025, the us versus them mentality is everywhere. And it can creep into our churches and into our own hearts, where if somebody is not a believer, they're the enemy. We don't like them. We don't like what you stand for. We don't like. That's how Jonah felt. These Ninevites, no, I'm not going there. They don't deserve to know about God. I know what they've done to my ancestors. I want to have nothing to do with them. And when Jonah said, throw me into the sea, listen, Jonah could have repented right then and there. He rented the ship out. He could have said, I'm going to pay you even more. Turn the ship around. I'm going back to Nineveh. But you know what he said? I would rather die and drown in the sea than tell those sinners about Jesus, about God. I'd rather die. I'm fine with that as long as those Ninevites die too. Unbelievable. You ever put that in the children's story? That's exactly what he said. You're going to have to throw me overboard, man overboard, because I'm not going. It's amazing. What does this mean for us in this us versus them mentality today? It means God is for everyone. God is for everyone. That's what it means. That there is nobody too far from God. God cares about the Ninevites. He cares about I don't even know if this is right, but he cares about the Tarshishites. I don't even know if Tarshishites is the right word. People that stand are all over the political spectrum. You know, they can all put their faith in Christ if they want to. That person that you avoid may be the person that God's calling you to. God does not prefer those who have been in the church the longest over those who have never been in the church at all. He calls us to go and tell them about him. That's what Jonah thought. God was still going to send Jonah to Nineveh, but now you don't just see God's heart for Nineveh, we see God's heart for Tarshish also. He used Jonah's rebellion to convert the sailors to now send as a witness. No more can it be said of Tarshish after another few days, perhaps a little bit there, a week or two of the cruise ship there. No more can it be said that there's nobody in Tarshish that knows the Lord. There's a witness for him there now. There's a team of sailors there that docked who are going to be able to tell everybody from firsthand experience they saw in working the God of Israel. Boat full of sailors just went. This, not only can we learn that God is for everyone through this, but we can also learn that we need to say yes to God. Say yes to God. In this world, there is full of hypocrites enough. Say yes to God. Don't be a hypocrite. If God is a God of mercy, then we as his people should be people of mercy. Of mercy. Grace and truth. Grace and truth. People, what happens if they're too much, not too much truth, but if there's emphasized truth too much, they do it to the lack of grace. Did you know that? And those who emphasize grace too much do it to the lack of truth, and both is a tragedy. Both is a tragedy. Say yes to God. Can I encourage you? God may even call you to do hard things. Was going to Nineveh the dream of your average Hebrew prophet of the day? God, would you pray? Would you send me to Nineveh? No. God may call you to do hard things. Is he allowed to call you to do hard things? Is he allowed to call you to do something that may be inconvenient? Say yes to God. Say yes to God. It's amazing, this whole chapter 1. If you read the book of Matthew in chapter 8, there's a parallel scene there. It's a parallel scene in that Jesus is asleep on a boat during a storm. It's amazing. This is called a type scene where scenes parallel each other. And in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus and his disciples enter a boat. The people want them to stay. They say no. They enter a boat and leave and go the opposite direction. And then before you know it, they're heading in the opposite direction on a boat. They encounter a violent storm also. All the disciples are trying to fix everything on the ship and they can't. But Jesus was in the bottom of the ship sleeping, wasn't he? Finally, one of them calls to Jesus. Jesus, you don't care that we're about to die? Oh, it's a rude awakening, isn't it? Similar to the Jonah one. Both were experienced sailors that couldn't weather the storm. Both Jesus and Jonah were asleep on the bottom of the boat during the storm. And both were rudely awoken by their shipmates. In both stories, God calmed the sea. Also, Jesus got up and said, "Peace be still." There, Jonah was sent overboard, but either way, God calmed the sea. In both stories, the shipmates were struck in fear of the Lord as a result of it. It's amazing. But there's one difference between them, a major difference, mainly between Jonah and Jesus. Jonah's sleep and now descent in the ocean was motivated by a desire to escape his calling. But Jesus' sleep and when he was crucified on the cross, descent into death and then raise up again, was motivated by a desire to embrace his calling. They both had tough callings. Jonah said no. Jesus said yes to the tough call. Jonah was merciless toward the people of Nineveh. He had no mercy whatsoever. He didn't want to have mercy. His heart was hard towards them. They get what they deserve was his attitude. Jonah did not want to preach God's judgment and mercy to the people of Nineveh, and he was stingy with God's grace. Yet Jesus is full of love and peace and mercy towards anyone who believes on him. After Jesus died on the cross and resurrected, he told his followers to go and tell the entire world about him. Go and tell everyone. That included both Tarshish and Nineveh again, you see. Jesus was not stingy with God's grace. Romans chapter 10 says there's no distinction between the Jew and the Greek. In other words, now that we read that today, the Jew and the Greek, in that time, you were either a Roman citizen or not, according to the Romans. And in that time, according to the Jewish people, you were either a Jew or you weren't. And there was this big division there, the Jews and the Greeks. And Paul's writing to the Roman church, and it says, it doesn't matter. The same God is rich upon anyone who calls upon him. God is not stingy with his grace. Are you stingy with his grace? Who have you not forgiven? What prompt has God put in your life that I've never said no, just never acted upon? We can protest silently and not even realize it sometimes. The good news is it doesn't matter. You may be on a ship to Tarshish right now in your life and saying no to God, and you may, God, can I tell you this? You may be in the depth throw. I'm already thrown overboard. You don't understand. Can I tell you, God can still use you? It's never too late to say yes to God. Never. It's never too late to get on board with his mission. Ever. Even the mistakes that you've made, God will use them for good, just like he converted those sailors in your life. Why? Because God is not stingy with his mercy. Let's pray. Father.